All right. Hey, we're in the second half of the book of Ephesians, right? I'm excited to be back in Ephesians this morning. And what's the second half of the book of Ephesians all about? Paul spells it out there in 3:21 going into 4 verse 1, and he says, "To him be the glory in the church and in Christ Jesus before all time, forever and ever. Amen." Okay, so what's the second half of the book of Ephesians about? It's about how God is going to receive glory in the church. How is God going to be glorified in the church that he has saved, that he has redeemed through the work of Christ that was described there in chapters 1 through 3. That's the second half of the book of Ephesians. Actually, it's the whole book of Ephesians, but the second half of the book. How is God going to receive glory in the church? And then 4:1 tells us broadly, generally, how God is going to receive glory in the church, where Paul says, "I urge you, therefore, as a prisoner of the Lord, to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you have been called." That's how God is going to be glorified in the church. He's going to be glorified through our worthy walk. As we live in a way that is worthy, a way that balances, that reflects the glorious weight and truth of the gospel. That's what we've been looking at now for weeks. Paul is telling us very practically, what does it look like to walk worthy of the gospel as a church so that God would be glorified by and in and through us. We've looked at a lot of very practical things in Ephesians chapter 4. We looked at telling the truth, anger, forgiveness, kindness. In chapter 5, Paul kind of summarized all of that and then turned almost on a hinge to a new topic. In 5 verse 1, he says, "Therefore be imitators of God as beloved children, and walk in love as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us, a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God." He's summarizing what came before, but also introducing in a way what's going to come next. Let me just read our passage this morning. Ephesians 5, 3 through 6. How are we to walk worthy of the gospel? "But sexual immorality and all impurity or covetousness must not even be named among you, as is proper among the saints. Let there be no filthiness, nor foolish talk, nor crude joking, which are out of place, but instead let there be thanksgiving. For you may be sure of this, that everyone who is sexually immoral or impure, or who is covetous, that is, an idolater, has no inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and God. Let no one deceive you with empty words, for because of these things the wrath of God comes upon the sons of disobedience." I want you to imagine something, okay? Imagine this scenario with me. Imagine that you were swimming in a large lake, all right? You're on the shores of a large lake swimming, and perhaps in there with you there's thousands of other people, maybe even millions of other people there on the shore of this lake, swimming around, floating around, having a good time. And you're there playing in the water just like you have for your entire life. When all of a sudden you notice a sign there posted that maybe you hadn't seen before, or actually maybe you had seen it before, but you just hadn't been able to read it for some reason. And as you focus on that sign and the words kind of start to come together for you, you realize that the sign says the following: "Warning, this body of water is chiefly comprised of raw sewage, arsenic, and highly toxic radioactive sludge from the old nuclear power plant. Swim at your own risk." What are you going to do in that moment? What are you going to do at that moment, right? You're going to do a bunch of things, actually, in quick succession. First, you're going to get out of that liquid as fast as you can. And then, as soon as you can, you are going to get as clean as you possibly can. And then you're going to get as far away from that body of liquid as you can. And then you're probably going to go and see a doctor to try to help get rid of as many of the adverse effects of swimming in that liquid as you can. And then, after that, you're probably going to spend some time warning as many people as you can about the dangers of swimming in that lake. Yes. Thank you, David. That too. But for the purposes of the illustration, those are the things that logically you are going to do as soon as you realize what you have been swimming in. Let me tell you what you're not going to do after that experience, okay? After that experience, and let's imagine you this was the place you had been playing in this lake since you were a kid. Okay, you got lots and lots of memories down there at the lake. But after that experience, you know what you're not going to do? You are not going to sit around and think wistfully of the wonderful times that you had down at the lake. You are not going to hang pictures in your house of you and your family at the lake, all smiling and laughing as you play in the toxic water that would kill you. You're not going to sit around and joke and reminisce with your friends about the good old days down at the lake. You're not going to go out of your way, on your way to work, take a different route, take a little detour, just to catch a glimpse of the lake. You're not going to go and maybe sit in the parking lot and spend hours just gazing out at the beautiful lake. You're not going to go down to the shore and walk to the water's edge and get as close as you can just to dip your toe one last time into the lake. And you're certainly not going to go jump into that lake to go swimming ever again. Does everybody agree with that assessment? If you came to the realization of what you had been swimming in, would all of those things would that be the logical response? I think the illustration should be pretty clear when it comes to the topic of sexual immorality and sexual sin and impurity, right? By God's grace, we, the people of God, we have escaped the corruption of a wretched and vile world. A world that we used to be a part of, but we have escaped the corruption that is in the world. This world that is run by lust. You know that, right? The world is run by lust. That's what John says in 1 John. He says, for all that is in the world. Want to know what's in the world? Here's what's in the world. The lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. That's what the world system is made of. That's what the world system operates on. Lust, and pride. And we, before we came to Christ, we were swimming in it. We were swimming in it, headlong, diving, going underwater. In the cesspool of impurity, and it would have eventually destroyed us. But by God's grace, we have escaped. And it seems like if that's the case, right? If the story that I just laid out is even somewhat of a good representation of what has happened for us spiritually, as we've escaped from the corruption, the lust, the impurity that is in the world, if that's true, it would seem to be pretty obvious then how we should relate to the lake from here on out. The response should be fairly clear. But it turns out that we still need instruction. And we still need reminders. And we still need encouragement. We still need exhortation when it comes to how we relate to the impurity, the lust that is in the world. Because as you drive through town, guess what? There's advertisements, there's billboards everywhere for the lake. Come down to the lake. Look, holiday at the lake, vacation at the lake. It's a great time. Our neighbors, our coworkers, they're every weekend, every day after work, they're going down to the lake and they're swimming around and then they come back and talk about the great time that they had down at the lake. And the whole world around us operates on the premise that this lake, the lake of impurity, is fine. It's no big deal. In fact, this is how you're supposed to live. And very few people, actually, from an earthly standpoint, from the world's perspective, really suffer any ill effects at all in the short term of swimming in the lake. Truth be told, there's still something inside of us that is drawn to the lake in an inexplicable way. So we need reminder, we need instruction. We have escaped from the impurity of the world. How do we relate to it now? How do we relate to it here in the church? That's what we find in this passage. Paul gives in this section here, and there'll be more to come next week, three instructions for how we, the church, must relate to the impurity in the world. So I want to see three instructions for how we, as people who have escaped, we escaped the lake. How are we to relate to it now? And it breaks down really this way. There's a command, okay? There's a command, there's a reason, and there's a warning. Command, reason, warning. That's what Paul gives us here as he instructs us in how to relate to the impurity that is in the world. The first thing we see is the command. This is really the action item for us. And the command really boils down to two things. In the church, we need to be getting as far away from impurity as possible. We need to be fleeing from impurity. And instead of impurity, we need to be known for thankfulness, for thanksgiving. That's really the two things here, right? Yeah, there's positive down here, that there must be thanksgiving among us, and then all of this talking about the impurity that we must be running away from. The command itself is expressed right here. This is the only verb. This verb, not even be named among you. All of these things that Paul lists, he says, these things must not even be named among the people of the church. And I want to clarify something about what that means right out of the gate, okay? Because I think there can be a lot of confusion about this. When Paul says that all these things, sexual morality, impurity, covetousness, that they must not be even named among us, he's not saying that we in the church, we just shouldn't talk at all about sexual sin. That these topics should never be brought up. These things, it should be kind of like taboo to talk about sexual sin or anything in this category. That's not what Paul's saying, okay? Paul, he's bringing it up here. So clearly it's not taboo. It's not a topic that's off the table. Paul's bringing it up here, and Paul brings it up a lot, actually. Paul is talking about this topic with almost every church that he writes to. He does it in 1 Corinthians 5 through 7. He does it in Romans 1. He does it in 2 Corinthians 12. Galatians 5, he brings up these same sins. Colossians 3. 1 Thessalonians 4, right? This is the will of God, your sanctification, that you abstain from sexual immorality. So it's not that when he says these things must not be named among you, he's not saying, oh, don't say these words, don't talk about these things at all. That's not the point. And yet, in most churches, I think sexual sin, sexual temptation is a topic that is treated almost as if it were taboo. And I understand that to a degree, right? Because there's a particular shamefulness that we feel when it comes to this category of sin. This category of sin, all sin is the same in some sense, but Paul calls out sexual sin in 1 Corinthians 6. He calls it out. There's something different about it, right? Every other sin that a person commits is outside of himself. But the one who sins sexually sins against his own body. And so sexual sin, it's a little bit different. And I do think there is a particularly high level of shame or guilt that we feel with this category. And I think that leads in a lot of churches that this just isn't brought up. It's not discussed. And so in one way, you could say the command is being followed in that church where, these things aren't being talked about, these sins aren't named, and yet that's not the spirit of the command, is it? Because people might not be talking about these things, but they're running wild, they're running rampant in people's lives behind the scenes, and that's certainly not what Paul had in mind here. So I think there's an irony, actually, in what Paul is commanding us here. He says, these things must not be named among you. And he's saying that in a particular way. I think the irony is that for the spirit, for the heart, for the purpose of this command to actually be fulfilled, there needs to be more talk. These things need to be talked about more in the church, in the right way, in the appropriate contexts. People confessing their sin to one another, people holding one another accountable, people being open and honest and sharing their struggles and then encouraging one another more and more as we see the day drawing near, so that this command is actually obeyed. What Paul has in mind for this command is obeyed in the proper way. And folks, like I said, there's really, there may be structures that we need to build as a church to facilitate that. As just in terms of creating context for people to be open, to be honest, to be sharing, to be confessing, those kind of things. Community group probably isn't the structure. It isn't the context for this kind of sharing and accountability. And so maybe we need to build more context out where people can do that. But at the end of the day, like I said, this has got to start in our hearts. It's got to start right in here, where we want to be transparent and build relationships and talk to people and get to know them and be able to say, hey, let's meet up every once in a while and let's just hold each other accountable in these ways. Though this is something that the right kind of talk about sexual sin is best when it happens organically, as people are seeking holiness and seeking sanctification. That needs to happen so that we can actually do what Paul means here, because he doesn't mean just don't talk about it. That's not the point. So what is the point? What does he mean? We had a discussion about this in our CG, and somebody said, like, this doesn't seem like a real strong prohibition. Like, I'm expecting Paul to land on this with both feet and just really say, hey, don't do this at all, cut it out, no sexual morality, don't practice these things. But the way it's written, it seems like maybe it's not quite as hard of a punch on this. I would actually argue that there is a very strong prohibition here, okay? There's a very strong call to holiness here, but maybe it doesn't come across as easily for us the way that this is written in English. This is a command, right? And we've talked about this. Maybe it doesn't sound like a command to our ears, but it is a command. You see this word must. We're translating, again, what we call a third-person imperative, a third-person command, which we don't have in English. It's a command. It's a command not to the people who are being addressed, but it's a command to, essentially in this case, these things: sexual immorality, impurity, and covetousness. These things must not be named among you. And it's just a different way of talking or structuring a sentence that we don't really have in English. But it is a command. This is an imperative. This is a must. And then when it comes down to the actual command that he gives, they must not be named among you. I think there's actually something very strong there. This is actually intended to be more strong than Paul saying just, hey, don't do these things. This is supposed to be a step stronger than that. When you think about it this way. Okay, so this line right there, this is doing these things. Okay, so Paul could say just don't do it. Don't cross this line. But I think one step removed from that is talking about it. And again, not talking about it in an ungodly way. Or not talking. What was I even saying? Not talking about it in a godly way. He's not saying that you can't. Don't mention these things. But to be talking about it in an ungodly way, to be talking about it in a worldly way, to be talking about sexual sin. So speech would be one step removed from action, if that makes sense. So I think what Paul is doing here is he's actually saying, hey, I'm not saying don't do it. I'm assuming that's assumed. I'm actually saying don't even cross this line. Don't even get close to it. And so this shouldn't even be like a topic of conversation where you're talking like the world about these things, much less doing these things. If I was to put it this way, okay, imagine that a dad and he's got a teenage kid, and his kid has kind of gotten in the wrong crowd and started smoking weed, okay, and the dad finds out about it. And he goes and he has a heart-to-heart with his kid. And at the end of that conversation, he says, now look, I don't even want to smell marijuana on you when you come home. What does the dad mean by that? Does the dad mean, hey, you can smoke as much as you want, but when you come home, I just don't want to smell it. So take a shower, change your clothes, and as long as you don't smell like weed, no problem. Is that what the dad means by that? No, that's not what the dad means by that. He's assuming with that command, no, I don't want you doing this. But he's actually drawing the line even further out and saying, I don't even want you getting close to it. I don't even want you getting close to this one step back. And so I think what Paul's point is here when he says that these things must not even be named among you, is that he's saying, man, you should be trying to get as far away from sexual sin and impurity as possible in your own life and in the church. You should be running from it. Not going down and saying, okay, how close can I get to the edge? Can I dip my toe in the lake one more time? And well, I'm not actually in the water. I'm just standing here. No. You should be running the other direction. Running away from impurity towards purity and holiness. That I think is the sense of this command when he says these things must not even be named among you. And that would just be a common theme in Scripture, right? That's what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 6:18. He says, flee sexual immorality. Run from it. Run away from it. Proverbs 5, right? Keep your way far from her, and do not go near the door of her house, talking about the adulterous woman. The great example of Joseph, right? Got in that situation, and they're being seduced by Potiphar's wife, and he didn't hang around. He didn't hang around to reason and hang around to think about it. He left his coat and got out of there. Now, this doesn't mean, and Paul clarifies this for us in 1 Corinthians 5, right? This doesn't mean that we are supposed to be necessarily not spending time or being around people who are sexually immoral. And Paul clarifies that, right? He says, look, if I meant that you needed to get away from everybody who practices sexual immorality, well, you couldn't go out of your house. You couldn't go have a conversation with you. You would have to leave the world, is what Paul says. So that's not what we're talking about here. We're not talking about a separatist kind of attitude where we're getting away from worldly people and saying, I can't associate with you because you're sexually immoral. What we're talking about here is that in our world, that just it smells, everything smells like the lake. Everyone swims in the lake. The lake is the topic of songs and TV shows and jokes and conversations. That we as the church, we should be far enough removed from that, where somebody would come in here and spend time with us and find that this is different. We have a different attitude towards impurity. And there's not a residue of the impurity of the world lingering in the church. They'd find a people who are running the opposite direction of what everybody else in the world is running towards. These things would not even be named among us. I think that's what Paul has in mind. And so what are we fleeing from? What are these things that Paul lists that they must not even be named among us here in the church, that we should as a church just be trying to get as far away as possible from these things in our practice and our words and our thoughts? He really breaks it down into two categories here. There's here you have works, impure works, immoral works. And then down here, in verse 4, impure and immoral words. Sexual immorality, that's the word porneia. And that literally, I think, refers to sexual acts outside of marriage. So adultery, fornication. Sexual acts outside of marriage with another person who is not your spouse. That's what that word means. This word here, impurity. Impurity is a more general word. And so this would cover other kinds of sexual morality, sexual impurity that don't fit into the more narrow category of porneia. But this would cover pornography and self-gratification and all those kinds of things. Any other broader practice of sexual morality or impurity that doesn't necessarily directly involve another person. And then this one here, covetousness. Now there's some debate about this one. Or some scholars think that this is just covetousness in general. Coveting after anything. Okay, wanting something that is not yours in general. And that's possible. Okay, that would fit in some sense. But you'd have to think, well, what he's very clearly, all of these other words are words that are sexual in nature. They have to do with sexual immorality. So why are we throwing covetousness in here and here? And you could say, what's the connection between just covetousness in general and sexual immorality? They're both worldly lust, the lust of the flesh, desire for physical things to satisfy your flesh. And so that would fit. I think it's a possibility. But I tend to think that when Paul brings up covetousness here, he's talking specifically about covetousness in a sexual context. He's talking about sexual covetousness, which is really what we would refer to as lust. When we talk about lust, we're really talking about sexual covetousness, sexual greed. And I do think it's interesting, right? You go back to the Ten Commandments, and what are the two things in the Ten Commandments that says you should not covet? Do not covet your neighbor's house or wife, right? And so sexual covetousness, sexual greed, desiring someone or something that is not yours to have, is a major category of covetousness. I just think, and we'll get to this in a second, I just think it's really helpful to think about lust. We use the word lust all the time. But to think about lust in terms of covetousness. Because there's an answer for that in this passage, okay? So there's these works, impure works, immoral works. These things must not be named among us. And then, verse 4, there's impure and immoral words. There's no filthiness. Filthiness is just obscenity. Okay, so obscene, vulgar words. You think about certain swear words that are used that have a sexual meaning. That would fit in this category. Filthiness, filthy words. Certain slang terms that would be used. Those would all fit in this category of filthiness. Foolish talk. Foolish talk, what Paul has in mind here might just be the kind of talk that would have been rampant, especially at parties where alcohol would lead to loose behavior culturally there. And you can just imagine the silly talk that would come about in speculation about, oh, maybe this person and that person, and what are they, and gossip and talk, just talking about things that really should not be talked about and speculated about. I don't know, but I imagine, just from standing at the grocery store checkout counter, that probably most tabloids are filled with silly talk in that way. I think that might be a pretty good illustration of what this would mean in our culture. If you think about a group of men and women standing around, and this happens in the world all the time, a group of men and women standing around talking about how attractive someone of the opposite sex is. That would be silly talk. I think that would fit in this category, foolish talk of a sexual nature. And then this last one, crude joking. Crude joking. Any kind of joking of a sexual nature, innuendo, all of those things in that category would fit under that term. All these things, they must not be named among us. We as a church should be removed from all of this, so that there's not a residue of these things in the way we talk and the way we act. And when we come in here, these aren't the things that we are driven by in the way that the world is. And why? Why is that? Paul calls out a couple of reasons here, right? He says, these things must not be named among you as is proper among the saints. And down here he says almost the same thing, but using a different word, that is filthiness, foolish talk, crude joking, they are out of place. And really both these words, proper and out of place, they mean essentially the same thing. It talks about being fitting. Filthiness, sexual impurity, immorality, it doesn't fit the saints. Because what does saints mean? What does saints mean? You can talk back to me. Set apart, holy ones. Folks, we are the saints. We are the ones who have been set apart. As Joe read earlier from 1 Peter, we have been set apart not by silver or gold or perishable things, but we have been bought and paid for and ransomed and purchased by the precious blood of Christ himself. And it doesn't fit. It doesn't fit for a group of people who goes by that name, who says, we have been purchased by God. We have been bought with a sacrifice of incomparable value. The blood of Christ himself. It doesn't fit for there to be a residue of these things among us. Impurity doesn't fit the saints. And I do think there's just a beautiful truth here, right? That Paul's saying, hey, we can't have these things. Why? Because we are saints. We are objectively saints. We are objectively holy. We have been made holy by Christ, sanctified by the blood of Christ once and for all. And so now we need to live in a way that fits that. And impurity and sexual immorality, they don't fit. They don't fit. So, we need to be fleeing from sexual immorality, running from these things, getting as far away as possible, not coming up as close as we can to the line. The goal would be that, look, when we go for a swim, we go for a swim in the gospel. That's what satisfies us. That's what brings us joy. And the world is going and playing in the pool of filth for their pleasure. But we go jump into Lake Tahoe, the crystal clear blue waters of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And that is the kind of people that we would be individually and together. And how refreshing is that, right? How refreshing is purity? How refreshing is a jump in Lake Tahoe as opposed to like Lake Erie near Cleveland, right? Or Clear Lake, California. We did our youth camp at Clear Lake every year, and I always explained something to the kids there. I said, look, there's a point at which during the week, if you don't shower long enough this week, there will be a point when you will be cleaner after you jump into Clear Lake than before. But until that point, you will actually be dirtier after you jump into Clear Lake than you were before you jumped into Clear Lake. Right? Think about just nasty bodies of water. It's not refreshing. Man, you go to Lake Tahoe and you look at that, and it's freezing cold, right? But I just can't help jumping in Lake Tahoe every time I go because it's pure and clean. To be a people who that's where we swim. We swim in the clean, pure waters of the gospel. And then to be a community of people that smell like that. That have that kind of feel about us. Rather than the residue of filth, impurity from the world. So I just want to encourage you and time. Okay, let me move and let me get back to application here in just a second. Because we've got to do communion. That's the command, okay? That's the command. These things must not even be named among us. And I'm just gonna fly through these last 2 points here, because we got a command and then we got a reason. Why must we be running away? Why must we be fleeing? Why should we be fleeing from sexual immorality and impurity? What does Paul say? It says, for tells us that this is a reason coming up. For you may be sure of this, that everyone who is sexually immoral or impure, or who is covetous, that is an idolater, has no inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and God. I gotta go back. I'm sorry. I'm like all off my notes now, but we've got to go back and get this. So forget that I just cracked up in verse 5. Good. Pause. Save that for later. Go back to here. Okay, because this is the great part. Instead, let there be thanksgiving. Okay, so go back and get your mind over here again. Right? All these things must not be named among us, but instead, there must be thanksgiving. Here's the question you got to ask: why thanksgiving? Why thanksgiving here? Right? He's got this list, the contrast: no filthiness, foolish talk, crude joking, but instead thanksgiving. Thanksgiving instead of sexual immorality and impurity and covetousness and all of this sexual sin. Why does he say then the opposite of that? What you need to be known for instead is thanksgiving. And here's, I think, the reason, right? He calls it out down here. Everyone who is sexually immoral or impure, or who is covetous, the same words, that is, an idolater, has no inheritance. Sexual sin springs from covetousness, lust, desire for something that God has not given you, has not provided for you in his wisdom, in his perfect plan. That's where sexual impurity springs from. Greed, covetousness, for something that is not yours. And so what's the opposite of that? Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving. To be a thankful people who say, God, thank you for what you have given me. And thank you most of all for giving me you. And in that way, I do think Paul he's given us a huge insight here into how to actually fight lust and impurity. You fight it with thanksgiving for what God has provided, not craving for what you want that you don't have. And ultimately, what that thankfulness is thankfulness for Christ, for the gospel. To be able to look and say, okay, there's all these things in life. Maybe there's things that I feel like I want, things that I crave that I don't have, but Christ has given me himself forever. Christ has paid for every sin. Christ has ransomed and redeemed me from hell for eternity and brought me into relationship with this wonderful, magnificent, glorious God. And so, anything else that I crave, anything else that I feel like I need, I have sufficient. I have enough in Christ. I am satisfied with Christ. I am content with Christ. And so I don't need to lust after anything else. I don't need to covet anything else because I have what I want. This is something I say a lot from up here. I have what I want. His name is Jesus Christ. And folks, at the end of the day, that is the only way. If you don't have that, that is the only way truly out of lust and impurity, is to be satisfied with Christ. There might be other ways to just kind of mechanically break habits or whatever. But the only real God-glorifying way out of lust and impurity is to say, I don't need that because Jesus Christ is enough for me. And for that, that's what should be named among us as a church. The people who are just so thankful for the gospel that everything else pales in comparison. Okay, that's how we deal with it. Here's the reason. You may be sure of this. Everyone who is sexually immoral or impure or who is covetous, that is an idolater, has no inheritance in the kingdom of God, the kingdom of Christ and of God. I've got to cut to the chase on this one. What is this intended to do? There's a lot of theology loaded in here. End of the day, verse 5 is giving you a reason for verse 3 and 4, and the reason is this. Sexual morality is serious. Sexual morality is serious, serious, serious business. When he says, you may be sure of this, that's a kind of a complicated phrase in Greek, where he loads up. And if you could put it this way, you can bet your bottom dollar on this. You can know this for sure. It's a strong way for him to say this. You can be certain of this. You flee sexual immorality, flee sexual temptation. Get away from these things. Get away from the lake. Why? Because everybody who is sexually immoral or impure or covetous, that is an idolater, has no inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and of God. Theologically, we've got to deal with who's he talking about here? Who does not have an inheritance? Who has no inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and of God? And I think it's really important to say, this doesn't mean that anyone who has ever committed one of these sexual sins is out. That's not what it means. How do we know? Well, number one, the gospel, just the way the gospel works can tell us that. But Paul specifically tells us that back in 1 Corinthians 6, right? 1 Corinthians 6, where he gives this list. He says, do you not know that the unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived. Neither the sexually immoral, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor men who practice homosexuality, nor thieves, nor the greedy, nor drunkards, nor revilers, nor swindlers will inherit the kingdom of God. And such were some of you. But you were washed, you were sanctified, you were justified in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ and by the Spirit of God. So we just got to be clear that when he makes this statement, when he gives these lists, folks, there are going to be people in heaven who have practiced sexual immorality and impurity and sexual covetousness and greed. But the gospel means that such people can be saved. And you know, we were all saved out of the lake. So it doesn't mean that, hey, one strike and you're out. It doesn't mean that if you've ever practiced these things, you're out. It also doesn't mean that true believers don't struggle in these areas, all right? You've got to acknowledge that. But what does it mean? It means that if you, as part of your lifestyle, this is your lifestyle to give yourself over to sexual impurity and immorality, then that is indicative of the fact that you do not belong to Christ. And that's serious. This is serious business. What's the intended effect here for us? You might look at this and say, well, is Paul saying I can lose my salvation? Like maybe I'm saved now, but then if I go and I commit adultery or I do one of these things and I lose my salvation? No. Okay? Theologically, that's not what Paul is saying. You can't lose your salvation. But there's a connection here. You need to flee from these things because of this reason in verse 5. So what does he want you to think? You hear a lot people say, well, once saved, always saved. All right? Theologically, that's true. But that's not actually the most important thing from our perspective. How this works from our perspective is what we call the perseverance of the saints. The perseverance of the saints is not, hey, I said a prayer, and so now no matter what I do, I'm going to heaven. That's not the perseverance of the saints. Jesus says the one who endures to the end will be saved. And so the perseverance of the saints, that doctrine in Tulip, in Calvinism is this, that if you are truly saved, if you are regenerated by the Spirit of God and you belong to Christ, then you will persevere to the end, following Christ. And if you do not persevere to the end in following Christ, then you were not saved to begin with. And so there is a sense, because from our perspective, it's not losing your salvation. But from our perspective, it's you need to persevere in obedience to the gospel. You need to persevere in faith. And there is a sense in passages like this where you look through the windshield. You look through the windshield of life. You're looking out at the future. And you should actually say, look, I am one choice away. I'm one lifestyle decision away from calling into question for myself and everybody else whether I am actually born again. I am one lifestyle choice away from giving myself and everybody else reason to think that I am not a believer and that I may never have been saved in the first place. And so when you look at some of these decisions, when you look at decisions for sexual, you look and you should think, if you're thinking about having an affair, you should think about it this way. This is a choice between adultery and Christ. As you're looking through the windshield of your life, that is the way that you should think about it on the basis of verses like this. If you're going to choose adultery, you are choosing adultery instead of Jesus. It's a serious, serious deal. That is the way you should think about it in light of this verse. That if you make that choice, you are effectively walking away from the faith. Because of what verse 5 says. If that's the way you want to live your life, I got no reason to think you're a Christian. Because Paul doesn't give me any reason to think you're a Christian. I'll never forget Piper. Piper told the story one time of how a young lady came to him, and she was a missionary kid and grew up in the church, and and said, "Oh yeah, I was saved at 6," but she's just living with her boyfriend and committing just a lifestyle of sexual sin. And she came and talked to Piper about this, and Piper said, "You know that if you don't leave him, you are going to hell." And that sounds strong to our ears. And a lot of people online take that and argue, that's salvation by works. No, it's not. He's just applying this verse. If you choose to live a life of sexual immorality, you make that choice to say, I love this more than the gospel. And that's verse 5 is intended to say, run away from sexual immorality. This is a serious deal. Verse 6, let no one deceive you with empty words. So we have command, a reason, and a warning. And what's the implication? Let no one deceive you with empty words, for because of these things the wrath of God comes upon the sons of disobedience, and these things are these things up here. Folks, the implication when Paul says let no one deceive you is that there's people who want to deceive you with empty words about sexual sin. And what they want to say is, it's no big deal. It's no problem. God will forgive you, so what? No worries, just do it. Everybody does it. And Paul says, don't let anybody talk you into the fact that this isn't a big deal. Because the wrath of God is coming because of these things. The world wants to deceive you that it's no big deal to swim in the lake. And guess what? Your flesh wants to talk you into it all the time. Your flesh wants you to believe that it's just no big deal. But it is a big deal. Okay? And again, look, we want to put all of that needs to go in the context of the gospel. I talked a minute ago about looking through the windshield of your life. You look through the windshield of your life and say, man, I am one choice away from the shipwreck of my faith. But when you look in the rear view mirror of your life, and you look back and say, I blew it so much back there. And the gospel says, yeah, and you know what? The blood of Christ, the work of Christ, is big enough to forgive even you. So we got to put all of this gets wrapped in the context of this gospel that calls us to holiness, calls us to live in a manner worthy of our calling, and says this is serious business. Hold fast the confession of your faith. Endure to the end. And it is finished.